we're under very unusual circumstances here. Can everyone hear me okay? I guess
Yes.
so.
Yes.
Okay, good. Good. Yeah, well, let's put it this way. If you can't hear me, let me know. Okay. So the subject for this morning is curriculum mapping. This was originally, of course, going to be an in-person workshop, and there were some problems with that. And then, of course, the plague descended upon us. So as an online remote workshop, it's going to be a little different. I mean, we scheduled 2 hours for this. I really don't imagine this will take 2 hours because I originally envisioned lots of back and forth and working together in groups and that sort of thing. And don't think this is really conducive to that, but we'll just see how it goes. I'm kind of flying by the seat of our pants here. So curriculum mapping is something that I've found useful in my position. I am the computing and engineering librarian at Miami University, as Daniela said, which does make me a STEM librarian. And STEM librarians have a lot of unique challenges. One of those is, as opposed to librarians in the humanities or the social sciences, people generally, the faculty generally don't seek us out to the same extent. We have to find ways to get our foot in the door and find ways to demonstrate our relevance. It's not always as apparent to them as it is in some other disciplines, because they tend to think of the library as books, as textual information, as references, as things that may have some oblique interest to them, but that don't necessarily impact their research and their study so much. So part of what we're doing is trying to find ways to demonstrate those links, and curriculum mapping is something that I've found is helpful with that. Okay, I don't know why I was muted there for a moment. It looks like I'm back on now. Curriculum mapping is, it was developed in educational circles and primarily as a result of teachers having to meet various state standards and regulations and mandates put out by state governments, federal governments, etc. And it was a way to show how what was being taught in the classroom met those particular standards. Tends to work backwards from the standard back to the classroom and what is taught. You'll find a lot of different definitions out there, because a lot of the material about curriculum mapping is specifically engineered for teachers in the classroom, especially secondary and primary teachers, more so than a lot of the stuff you'll find for colleges, and especially for a lot of the stuff you'll find for librarians. But it still can be very useful for librarians in tracing what's going on in the various curricula in our schools and how our library instruction can be mapped to that. One very simple definition I like is a description of the path from introduction to mastery of a subject area. You'll find a lot more convoluted definitions of curriculum mapping than that, but for me, that's the most basic level of what it's about. Just following the course that a student goes through when following a particular course of study. Typically, it will be diagrammed using concept mapping software, spreadsheets. We're just going to deal with spreadsheets today. There are all sorts of software packages out there that do this, though. Some of them get very involved. Some of them cost money, some are freeware. Again, a lot of them are more involved than we're going to get into today, because once you start down this path, you can get very involved depending on the sort of granularity you want to go down to and the sort of Well, when someone's doing it, creating curricula to meet a state standard, of course, they have to go to a level that we're not going to be interested in going to. But there is a lot of software out there that will help someone who wants to work at that level. So, as I've said, this particular approach was designed for teachers more so than librarians. So why do librarians want to even bother with it? Well, there's a number of reasons here. One is to discover underserved courses and course sequences. And again, in STEM, this is particularly relevant. For me, following this path has allowed me to identify courses where information literary instruction would be beneficial, but perhaps the instructor has never thought of it that way. It's just a great way to familiarize yourself with what's going on in your departments, what the various courses are, how they relate to each other, and how they might relate to information literacy principles. Second, make connections to the ACRL framework, which is what we're going to be working with today primarily. I'm sure all of you are familiar with that framework. There are other frameworks or other instructional schemas you might want to work with depending on what is typically used at your library, but that's what we'll be working with today. Enhance and expand the range of learning objectives. Again, just a way to move beyond sort of the reflex, here's how to search for an article sort of teaching, to sort of expand our horizons a little bit and get us thinking outside the box about ways that what we have to offer can be applied to various courses within disciplines. Analyze departmental connections to the library. As I said before, some departments tend to have a closer relationship at libraries than others, and those vary from institution to institution, of course. Some libraries have a very close relationship with their engineering departments. Many do not. Most have a close relationship with their humanities department, but a lot of it just depends on personalities involved and how things have been set up in the past, and whether there are, I used to work at RPI, and there were joint courses taught by engineering faculty and librarians. So we had a very close relationship there, but other institutions that can be very different. And it's also a way to streamline instruction. There's a lot of redundancy sometimes in what we're doing, and curriculum mapping gives you a way to look at the big picture and see what's going on and see maybe if certain students might be getting hit with the same thing over and over again. So some of the questions that curriculum mapping confronts are students receiving the same material time and again? Are we hitting the same notes over and over again and neglecting some more extensive things that we could get into? Are the same skills being stressed in every class? Once again, are we just talking about how to search for articles over and over again? Are there other things we could be doing? Are there more efficient ways to deliver instruction? Some of the standard instructional skills that we hit on again and again might be more efficient delivered in an online tutorial, or something that's recorded. It could be asynchronous, rather than having face-to-face class time. Again, curriculum mapping is a way to sort of look at the big picture, see what we're doing, and see what classes or materials could be dealt with that way. Are there missed opportunities? And again, for STEM, I think this is a big one. What courses are being taught that we could add some value to that we're not currently dealing with? What courses are we maybe not familiar with once we look over the curriculum a little more closely that could possibly have a connection to library research? And again, with the STEM fields, when you're getting to the technical things, and we're going to look primarily at computer science here in a moment, when you're dealing with these technical fields, the connections aren't always so obvious and require a little more a little more aggressive thinking? And do our instructional strategies make sense? Is the way that we've always done things the best way to do things? And again, curriculum mapping is a way to look at that. One of the things we're aiming for in doing the mapping is coherence, is having a coherent instruction policy, whether that's for a department or whether that's just for your individual instruction in your disciplines. Curriculum should have a vertical and a horizontal coherence. Now, by vertical coherence, I mean that our instructional strategies are constructed so there's a meaningful sequence. Upper level courses build on skills learned in lower level courses. Of course, the material presented by the faculty in those courses follows that pattern. There are prerequisites. You have more basic information and then more involved information is built upon that. And our library instruction should try and follow that same pattern. So if more basic skills can be taught in more basic classes, we can get to the more advanced skills in more advanced classes. We also want some horizontal coherence. Are students learning the same skills as students in other classes at the same level? In library terms, that could mean that freshman level computer science students should be getting the same skills as freshman level history students. That won't always map out exactly, but we're not trying to be perfect here, but we're trying to have sort of a general coherence and a general sense of what's going on. Of course, one of the problems we're going to run into is that students often almost always cross disciplinary boundaries. And what I mean by that is a computer science student is still going to take freshman composition. So they're going to be confronted with some library research training in a composition class, whether or not they get it in a freshman level computer class. So we do need to keep that in mind. Trying to map every possible permutation that a student's progress through their major would make will be beyond what we can really do, but there are a few constants. Like I said, composition is going to be a constant. Now, most colleges and universities will have some sort of core of courses that students need to take also, but since students have a number of choices in those, it's a little more difficult to rely on those as indicators of what sort of information literacy training students have had so far. So another thing to keep in mind as we begin to work through this is the relationship to the library of the different departments that we work with. As I mentioned earlier, some of these can be very organized. If you have a relationship with one of your disciplines where there are team talk courses with librarians, that sort of thing, you have a very organized relationship. Librarians speaking at their orientations, for example, that sort of thing, that's one sort of relationship. Sometimes there's just a one-shot relationship. A librarian regularly gets invited to come teach class and how to find an article, how to use academic search premier, that sort of thing. And another relationship is an underrepresented relationship. And that is where you get little or no contact with the department. Again, as I mentioned before, STEM librarians tend to run into this a lot. More technical the field, mathematics is always a good one. I know the only time we generally hear from the mathematics department at our university is there is one course that has the students do a paper on a historical subject in mathematics. Other than that, we don't hear a lot from them, which doesn't mean that we don't have something to contribute. It just means that we need to look a little closer at how we might do that. So once we sit down and start to actually look at the courses and look at the outcomes and how we can relate the two, we need to have some sources for the library or the course material that we're going to be looking at. And this can be as involved or as, well, this can be whatever level of depth and granularity you want to go to. Today, what we're going to be looking at is primarily course descriptions, but there's a lot more, and learning objectives, but there's a lot more stuff that you can use depending on how comprehensive of a mapping project you want to take. Learning objectives and course descriptions are listed by the departments, hopefully. You might want to take a look at syllabi from some of your, if some of your faculty are willing to share those with you to get an even more in-depth idea of what different courses cover. LibGuides, especially if you're looking at some of the, if you want to compare to some of the material that your colleagues are covering in other disciplines, looking at their LibGuides is one place to get some information. And even interviews, focus groups, and I'd throw surveys in there with your faculty and students as well. Just again, to get an idea of what's being taught, of what's being learned, of more of a sense of what the classes are about. And auditing classes now and then is not a bad idea either. When we talk about interviews and focus groups with faculty too, I always like to mention that these can serve multiple purposes. On the one hand, you're gathering information, which is what we're talking about doing here. On the other hand, every time you do any sort of information or data gathering with faculty, you're also getting your name out there and you're marketing the fact that you're interested in what they're doing, or that you have some expertise in an area that maybe they hadn't thought of. I've used this before in other areas, like I do work with gathering research data and helping faculty practice good data hygiene and cleaning up their data, making sure that it's usable and shareable and all that sort of thing. But I've done surveys that I've sent out to faculty about their data storage, data management habits. And what that does is it gives me information about where they're at, which is kind of frightening sometimes. But it also lets them know that this is a subject that I'm interested in and I have some expertise in. So they're more likely to follow up with me than if I just send out a notice saying, hey, I'm into this or whatever. It gives you a way to get your foot in the door and develop more of a relationship with your faculty. So methods, I mentioned some of these already, but just again, physical methods can be, people will make Word documents and forms, and we have something like that here, but so you can pass those out physically. A lot of people use spreadsheets. That's probably, you know, the most basic way to go. And again, as I said before, there's all sorts of concept mapping software out there. So we're going to be looking at course lists, and we're going to be mapping them against the ACRL framework. Again, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the ACRL framework. I'm going to go through it here. The order that it's in here was created by our head of instruction. And for each of these, we're going to have some examples of possible, sub outcomes that we're going to map different courses to. That'll make sense in a moment. So let me just go through these and talk a little bit about each one and how it might relate to the subject area we're going to look at, which is computer science, to sort of get ourselves primed to think a little creatively before we actually start looking at the courses themselves. So, and you've all heard these many times, I know. Number one, in searching as strategic exploration. And some of the outcomes linked to this Students will be able to implement searches in multi-purpose database and on the web, understand the difference between web and database. That's very basic. Something that's important to know, but that's at a very basic level. The rest of this information primarily goes along with that basic searching, being able to search for an article, being able to find an article, apply these searches to their disciplines. Some of our computer courses have deal with computer ethics or computing and programming and its effect on society. Those courses are going to be a nice fit with these sort of outcomes because they will involve a lot of the traditional searching for articles in article databases. One thing that stands out to me here, though, also is 1.4. Students will be able to construct a search strategy using Boolean and subject headings or data-specific thesaurus terms. Since some of our computing courses deal with Boolean logic, there might be a little bit of an inroad there in being able to use library searching as an application of that logic, since they already understand it, and making that bridge to make them understand that their knowledge of what are sometimes some very complicated Boolean set construction will translate to being able to do some very involved searching, more so than maybe they were aware that they were capable of. Okay, number 2, information creation as a process. Multiple perspectives, different type of information, how information develops over time. Again, looking at some of these outcomes, they tend to be related to, again, that traditional searching for library and academic journal articles, but there's other things in here too. 2.4, distinguish between different types of sources, most appropriate type for information need. Students doing programming often, and again, they don't often realize that's what they're doing, but they're doing information searches when they're trying to find a solution for a particular problem, or what sort of algorithmic library will work with a particular project they're working on. 2.5, non-academic sources. People in computing use these a lot. A lot of discussion forums and things like that, and knowing how to create a query or even just ask a question on a forum in a way that is useful is a research skill. It's an information literacy skill. 3, information has value. This is something we often need to stress to all of our students for a number of reasons, not the least of which to combat the notion that information is all free and available on the internet and you don't need a library. That's always a good one, but also this particular outcome has a lot to do with plagiarism and properly citing things, and this again has impact on computer science. And again, just using computer science as an example, but as you work through different disciplines, you'll begin to see ways that these particular framework outcomes attach themselves to different aspects of those disciplines. But in computer science, properly citing things is as important as it is in journal articles, and giving credit where credit is due. Realizing the difference between something that's freeware and shareware and something that's a commodity, and understanding how to attribute things, what sort of software licenses are being invoked. All this sort of thing fits right into this framework, even though, once again, it's not the traditional sort of things we associate with library research. Research as inquiry. A lot of this has to do with learning how to use your librarian, how to use library services. Bit more of a stretch with some of the STEM fields, but I think there's still some openings there, especially being able to apply the proper research methods. understanding that research is iterative. Again, something that plays right into computer science, and some of the techniques for software development that rely upon being iterative and constantly coming back and improving and refining, connecting that idea with the idea of information literacy and research. Number 5, authority is constructed and contextual. What makes something authoritative in their disciplines, which again in STEM fields might be a little different than in some other fields, but realizing that there are different standards, for technical standards, for example, that are certified by different bodies and different associations like IEEE, and what they do and how they grant authority to information. Students recognizing that they might be an authority in any area. Again, in STEM fields and things like computer science and fields where students are doing a lot of entrepreneurial work and are developing a lot of their own products, that's something that can be very interesting. And 6, scholarship as conversation. Bibliography, footnotes, references, not as important, again, for some courses, but certainly if students want to go on and be published and are looking to go into graduate study, no matter what their field is, that's important. Also, again, the students that are doing reports and papers and discussions of how their technical field relates to society as a whole. They're going to be pulling stuff from a lot of different databases, a lot of different articles. Understanding that research works as a conversation with a lot of back and forth, and again, relating this to computer science. Students look at things like GitHub, where you have different people working on different projects and branching out and adding their own expertise to something that's already been started by someone else. That's a natural fit for this idea of scholarship as conversation. So, after looking at those framework outcomes, and then going on to look at steps. First thing you're going to want to do is gather the information sources. As I said, those can be course descriptions, different things from your bulletin or catalog at your institution, as well as information gathered from syllabi and from interviews with faculty and some other information gathering. Excuse me. Typically in a spreadsheet approach, I would list the courses in a column. I would list my outcomes in rows. And what we're going to do is go through and mark cells where the outcomes match the courses. And I also want to go through and highlight core courses. This is going to be a little tricky to do online here, but we'll see how this goes, because I almost would be helpful to have multiple screens here, but that's not going to happen. So I've got a spreadsheet here where I have I've listed all the computer science courses at my institution. And next to the courses, I have the outcomes that are numbered according to the sheets we just looked at. And I'm going to pull up, oh, I lost it here, hold on. Just a moment. Okay, there they are. I'm going to pull up, I've got my list of those learning outcomes, since I can't fit all the text on the spreadsheet, I've just got the numbers on the spreadsheet. But I have my, I have a cheat sheet here, so I don't have to keep referring back to it, and just tell you what the different numbers stand for. And I'm going to open my course listing here, and let me try and get these one screen here. I'm used to having multiple screens, as I'm sure most of you are. Okay, where'd my... Okay, oops, it doesn't want me to shrink it that far. Okay, there we go. This sort of thing was easier back in the old days of Windows. Okay, there we go. So I can see my list in Excel here of courses, and I have my list on the computer science website. So I'm just going to go through and look at some of these. I'm not going to, obviously not going to do all these in the time we have here, but just sort of give you an idea of how this works. Let's look at CEC 101, Computing Engineering and Society. This is a CEC course, not a CSE course. So this is actually for the entire computer and engineering department, not just computer science. Course designed for first-year students with majors in the College of Engineering and Computing. Okay, so this is going to hit pretty much anybody majoring in any of those areas. So if I'm primarily thinking about computer science majors right now, this is going to be a course that they're all going to take. So I know that they're all going to be in this particular course and at one point in their career. And if I go down and look at the course objectives, gives me an idea about what sort of things are covered in this course. Identify engineering fields, analyze issues related to professional ethics. This is a case where I might actually want to contact the instructor, because it doesn't tell me here if they work on a paper or anything like that. I have a feeling they probably would. But if it turns out to be the sort of course where students would be doing the traditional database searching, then I want to mark that on my spreadsheet. And I'm just going to do that by doing format cells and doing a, hold on, let me do a fill. And we're not getting that as an option now. You know what? Now I'm just going to put an X in there. So the same thing, if I go through in 1.2, students will be able to compare and contrast library resources, select the resource for the need. Let's say I think that's going to be relevant in that course. I'll mark that. 1.3, students will determine if retrieved information satisfied need, refine search, sure. And I can go on down. Pretty much everything in number 1 is going to be relevant there. And I can go on down to number 2. Students will distinguish between format and method of access. This is going to be relevant as well. And I can go on down my list there. And again, I'm not going to take the time to do that now. But as I go down through the courses, I can look at some other ones here. Let's say, I know technology, ethics, and global society is another course that's going to use some traditional research. And you can see required topics, learning outcomes, ethical dilemmas, specific ethical issues. So this is going to involve research that isn't just a matter of programming. It's going to involve research in the sort of thing that we can provide these students with: access to databases, access to peer-reviewed research. So this particular course is actually one that I was able to get my foot in the door, and they had never asked for any instruction before, but after working through this process, this one especially stood out for me as one that could use, some of that traditional here's how to find your sources. Here's how to evaluate some of the lower level things here in 1 and 2. If we go on, some of the other, courses, some of the higher level courses, I'm getting into things like algorithms. It's going to be a little more tricky. Course outcomes, runtime storage requirement, proposed algorithms. These are all, this is all very technical stuff. This isn't going to involve so much of traditional library research. But if I look at some of my higher level information, like say information has value. So if I'm going to go and look at some of those topics, and I'm going to look at, say, 3.1, students will give credit to others' works through proper citation. Students will analyze issue of information privacy. Students will compare types and quality of information from free and proprietary sources. So there's a few things in there. Where did I algorithms? I just lost it. 374. Oh, I'm not down far enough. So if I go down a little bit here, algorithms, and I want to mark some of those, and the threes. Shift was that pane. Okay, so let's go on down to 3.1 and 3.3 are two that I think are especially useful. So that's going to be N and P. So just giving you an example of how some of this can work, and this is pretty tedious to do in a presentation, but I just wanted to give you sort of an overall idea of what this looks like. So as you go through and you mark these things, you start to see what courses map with which particular outcomes. And another thing that you might want to do is then go back in and look at majors and see, for example, especially if you're interested in computer science again, what are the curriculum requirements for a computer science major? Find out what the core courses are, 101, 102, and just go through. And again, I'm not going to do all of this right now, but just go through and mark, if you want to highlight them in some way or whatever, what all the core courses are. So then when you go through and you look at your X's and you see what you've marked, you see which ones are in the core courses that you know everyone has to take in that major. So you know you're hitting all the computer science majors in that particular, for that particular outcome. Now, another thing you can do once you start to get a list of those is for each subject area, you can fill out a sheet like this where you can go back, look at your spreadsheet, see which courses mapped to which outcomes. Let's see, let's say CEC 101, that seemed like it mapped to a lot of, to most of these. So I could just put this in here for each one. So, and then for each of these, if you have some standard activities that you've developed, you can then apply these also, activities or particular lesson plans or particular projects. For example, if for this, it's just, you know, you're just doing basic library research for most of those. But let's say if you wanted to look at something more advanced, as we did with CSE 374, we saw that hitting some of the section 3 outcomes. So if you go back to our document and 374. So you go back to our document, and if you go down to section 3 and you want to put in CSE 374 there. CSE 374. And maybe you have particular activities, or you're going to develop particular activities in relation to computer science, say, that would fit into a presentation in that particular class, and that would then relate to the outcome we're looking at there. So let's say you had a project that went along with GitHub. Well, then your GitHub project, you would put that in here. And the overall goal of this, in the end, is to get an overview. So when you look at your spreadsheet, you have an idea of what outcomes you've hit and what classes you've hit them in, and you can begin to construct forms like this where you can go down and see that you're hitting different outcomes, where you're hitting them, and what sort of projects you can pull out of your tool chest that that would help you connect those particular outcomes to what's being done in those particular courses. So I've gone through this at a very basic level. Again, it's kind of a hard thing to demonstrate in this manner. It's almost better if you have people sitting around a computer or sitting around with paper forms or something like that. But I think at this point, I will open this up and take some of your questions or comments, which I think you've been putting into chat. Okay, there we go. Need to drop out to return for another meeting. Daniela, webinars recorded, level detail. Allison, yeah, the level of course description at Miami. You know, unfortunately, that varies from department to department. I'm doing the same thing with the physics department, and they don't give you anything like that. They give you a very brief little course description, but they certainly don't give you learning outcomes or much information about the class other than that. Computer science is really good about that, though, which is why I use them as an example. Okay, any other comments or questions?
Would it be all right if I just use audio to ask my question?
Certainly.
Because I started to type this out and I realized there's a little bit of qualification that I was sort of going to take me a while to actually type coherently.
Sure.
I'm wondering a little bit about this from, I guess, the project management perspective. It seems like this, right? The best case scenario for a project like this would be, you know, to figure out where those connections exist would be to be doing this across the entire,
Sure.
not just within your STEM departments, but including those English and history and humanities and social sciences and everything like that. I guess both wondering how you are doing it at Miami, whether this is library-wide or departmental, and if you can speak to getting buy-in from, you know, somebody who says, well, I understand what goes on in my departments. This is a lot of extra work that I don't need to do, that kind of thing. and then also scalability, whether this is something that can be done on the level of one person, maybe even not even taking a comprehensive look at the entire curriculum, but just looking at those core classes, things like that.
Okay, let me answer a couple of the briefer questions on the chat here, and then go on to that with all my qualifications that I'll add, all my dependent clauses. Brian Gray, well-trained library student worker, sure. I don't see a reason why they couldn't be trained to do this. Catherine, examples where the mapping led to new instructional opportunities. Yeah, that specifically that course, Computer Ethics and Society, that I had not been invited to before. I was able to get my foot in the door on that one by going through this process and identifying that that the things they do in that course would be directly relatable to library work. Kyle told me current syllabi are supposed to be on file. I haven't actually tried to do that. I haven't worked with syllabi. I know some people have, which is why I included that in this presentation. But hey, if they're on file, that's great. And two, of course, I don't have it. Okay, regarding the question about scalability and about buy-in. Okay, this was a department-wide initiative at our library in the sense that we were all encouraged to do it. One of the ways they got buy-in was having a lot of the group work done by some library interns, as far as we didn't have to actually make the spreadsheets or put all of our list all of our courses. They kind of had people go in and do that for us. So that helped with, with people say, oh, I don't have time to do this or whatever. If someone says, oh, I know what I'm doing in my department. Well, it's kind of hard to push someone that doesn't want to budge. If you can, and what we have not done at our institution, if you can get everybody to buy in and then sort of merge the information that they found so that you are able to cross, and this would, software wise, I'm not sure, there's tools that would probably do this much better than the way I'm doing it here. But if you could sort of merge everyone's mapping so that I can see just my computer science courses, but if I want, I can see a university-wide list of courses so I can get an idea of all of my computer science courses. Students have encountered basic library research in their composition course, or maybe they've encountered it in their composition course and in what we call UMP 101, the Welcome to College Kids course. If they've hit some of those things in several areas already, so then I can decide, well, I really don't need to hit that in any of the computer science courses, unless of course, an instructor really wants that. Or I can assume that they've had the basics, so I can go a little more in depth even within that particular outcome. Scalability, I think it's certainly useful. If nobody else in your institution wants to do it, I think it's certainly useful to do yourself for yourself. I mean, it's useful to me. I think just as a way to find those gaps, find those classes that are slipping through the gaps, or just to get a sense of what you could be doing more of, or the scale of things that you're hitting. And again, part of this is just a way to be able to implement some more advanced types of bibliographic instruction into our teaching, rather than always falling back on sort of the same thing. When you bring up plagiarism, a lot of faculty always seem to be interested in that, but especially if you kind of tie that into intellectual property and some of the technical fields where students really are interested in things like patents, and or perhaps planning to create some profitable endeavors when they engage at the university. That's library research, and we can tap into that. That was a long-winded answer. Okay. Any other questions?
This is Allison. I was just going to make an observation that we worked across the curriculum, but did not do this course-related mapping so much as we tied the information literacy framework to different levels in kind of a general sense. And just doing that was pretty darn challenging.
Yeah.
But I think that the kind of mapping you've shown us would be really more compelling, maybe to STEM faculty, to see that we had, looked at syllabi and course descriptions and really been thoughtful about the information goals for each class, not just the, kind of the general across the curriculum ones that we have done. If anyone, I'm going to share my screen and just show you the infographic kind of thing that we came up with. Oh, I can't do that.
Who's in control of that? I think maybe Danielle is. Or wait, no, I guess let me see if I can unshare my screen.
Unshare, and then I'll just share it briefly.
No, I have just one participant can share at the time. That's why I will change the settings.
And I could just actually send the Google link, and people could look at it on their own.
There we go. I just stopped sharing.
Yeah.
Let's see. I wonder which one I want to share. I have way too many things to share, obviously.
Okay.
So, yeah, I'll put it in chat so that people can look.
Sure.
Yeah,
their,
that would be great.
they want to.
Yes. Matt, I have a question for you. Do you find that is more successful to reach out to specific faculty and present this kind of list, or it's better to go to higher level, to the chair or even higher, the dean and show them?
That often, that depends on your relationship with any of those individuals and how they, there's some chairs or deans who would be very interested in this and want to implement it, and some who will not. I've mostly just done this with individual faculty and not sharing with them the entire process or the entire document, but just simply pointing out to them, hey, I've been looking at your course you're teaching. These are some things I can think to add to it, and not, mentioning ACR framework, or any of this library-centric stuff, but more, one of the things we teach is intellectual property and how to relate, how to properly attribute things and that sort of stuff, and interest them on that level. If you're going higher, more of a overview might be useful. I always try and translate things out of librarian terms, though, and out of librarian speak. So a lot of the language and the descriptions in the ACL framework may or may not be useful, but just sort of translating those into things the faculty will appreciate is a way to get your foot in the door.
And did you come across of any faculty that would say there is no time in my class or something like that?
I mean, I've gotten faculty that aren't interested. I've got faculty that simply don't respond. Do calls and emails and whatnot. And I mean, there's only so much you can do. It's still a matter of if they're not willing, and it might be possible to go to a dean or department head to sort of add a little pressure onto that, but I generally don't want to tick people off, and that can backfire in that way. But you know, if they're open, if there's a closed door, there's only so much you can do. But if there's any sort of opening that you can squeeze your foot into. Zach, questions you might ask in interview focus group surveys to gather relevant info. I've not done interviews or focus groups relating to this before. It's just an option that's out there, though, that I know others have done and that I might be interested in doing in the future. So I would, in interviews especially, I think I would, you know, just concentrate on what do you do in your course? You know, asking about the outcomes, which are, for computer science at least, are listed around the web pages is nice, but sort of ask them, what do those outcomes mean to them, and what do they want the students to be able to do or understand at the end of the course? And so again, you can have some hooks to attach your various library outcomes to, so they kind of sync together. But again, primarily just, you know, what do you do in your course? I mean, that's what it all comes down to. We have all sorts of exotic educational language out there, but what actually happens in there? Okay, any more questions? It's been nice talking to you all on this in this very, very strange time we're living in. I guess this was a little awkward, but I guess we're all going to have to get used to doing these sorts of remote discussions from our underground bunkers as things progress. I appreciate your attention, and I hope you all have a nice weekend.
Yes, thank you, Matt, and thank you everybody for participating. I've been interested in this topic for a long time. I never seen it as customized to STEM fields. I envy you for the details of the class. For each class you have posted online. I was just checking now again. I don't have that. I will have to ask everybody, every faculty, to give me access to their syllabus, or even if we can get it from the office, that would be great.
At the very least, you should have in the online bulletin, there should be a course description.
It's very short and not a lot of objectives there, so learning objectives not gonna work. Anyway, it was really, really good information. Thank you for presenting, and Matt, and thank you everybody, and stay well.
Okay, thank you, you too.